purity, virginity, and abstinence culture.
Yeah.
This is something that, I mean, 99% of people I talk to have said they've been affected in a negative way by.
Mhm.
Why do you think purity culture has been so harmful? Again, this could be a whole podcast episode.
Yeah.
And why do you think that it's something that is like a consistent experience across the board, even amid like different denominations, different religious contexts? Like this one
Mhm.
seems to really hit a
Mhm.
lot of people.
Yeah. So I think it's important to note for the purposes of this conversation, we really are talking about purity culture in line with abstinence and virginity. When we look at the history of purity culture, we know there is deeply racist roots. We know that it goes beyond just sexual purity.
Mhm.
But for this conversation, we'll kind of keep it under this under this umbrella. You
There you
know,
go.
'cause
Another
we all
Freudian slip.
we all love our umbrellas. So in terms of like why the impact and then kind of like why do we see this in other religions as well or other systems as well? I really believe that our sexuality is the essence, the core of who we are. And when I say sexuality, I do not just mean like who are we smashing genitals with? I mean like the way that we navigate through the world, how we engage in relationships, how we make decisions, social justice issues, what we're passionate about. That's all connected to our inherent sexuality. And and that is very dangerous for systems that want to control you because that means you're tapping into yourself for wisdom and knowledge and direction and choice rather than them. And so, if we can vilify that part of us, I think that leads it to be easier to control somebody or a whole group of people. Um, I know that that probably could be a much bigger discussion there,
Sure.
but I think that also kind of answers that second or just like why do religions in particular do this? It's that answer, but it's essentially stripping away everybody of their core humanness
Hmm.
and making it putting it under the authority of whatever the rules of that group are. And how can we not be impacted by that?
Hmm.
On an individual level, we think about just the physiological and psychological impacts that can have, but it impacts our relationships. It impacts like generational pieces. It
Hmm.
impacts how we operate in the world. It impacts legislation. It impacts all sorts of different, areas of our lives. And so, in the work that I do at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, we, of the clients that come in, I would say 90 to 95% of them are all working through something related to purity culture and or it pops up in the work, even if that
Yeah.
wasn't what they were coming in for to begin with.
Yeah. I think again, this goes back to things that just go into your default operating system. And like,
Mhm.
because again, so many people are raised with these kinds of teaching.
Yeah.
I've mentioned on the show, like men are taught like, hey, sex is awesome, don't have it, and
Yeah.
don't ask questions about it. Girls are taught like, you're not really interested in sex, you're interested in the emotional side,
Mhm.
like all of the things of, women want love, men want respect, like all
Yeah.
that teaching
Mhm.
um, just falls into the default. But even beyond that, because I think I've talked about that so much on the show,
Mhm.
like the two things that have really, I feel like are underserved in this conversation is men are affected by purity culture teaching too. Because
Mhm.
I think
Yes.
there's things about, cutting off emotion, being taught you're not emotional, being
Mhm.
taught you can't control yourself, being taught like there's
Yeah.
so much. And I think it gets glossed over because men on the surface benefit from the system. But the truth is, you're not really benefiting.
Yeah.
You're just not
Yeah.
being outright abused
Yeah.
in the way that many people are who are,
Yeah.
in the female side of this conversation.
Yeah.
You're being trained to be abusive in many
Mhm.
cases.
Yeah.
And again, it may give you more power, but is that something that's beneficial to a fulfilling life?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a single man I've worked with or talked to that has come out saying, "Yeah, purity culture was actually really beneficial for me."
Yeah, it was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, then, a lot of times the amount of shame, well, I think everybody experienced shame and a huge amounts of it just in different ways, like
Mhm.
coming from different places. But the amount of shame that I hear from the men that I've talked to, it's astronomical. I mean,
Mhm.
they are scared of themselves. They are feels like they're out of control. They're this sexual animal that is never satiated and has no control over their body and what their body will do in the presence of a female that, you know, might make them stumble. Like
Mhm.
it's just it's so much. And I grew up with male siblings, so I felt like I actually have a pretty balanced perspective of like the impact
Mm.
um, on men as well as my lived experience as a woman. And I really remember, and obviously purity culture, high control religion taught me to think like this, but
Mhm.
I really thought at the time men had it way worse because they just were
Mm.
so visual and they couldn't help themselves and they were lusty creatures and like all these things. And I was really convinced like it is my job as their sister and then as
Mm.
a sister in Christ to make sure that I did whatever I needed to do, whether
Yeah.
that was change the way I talked or walked or dressed or how I did my hair or who I interacted with, or even dumbing myself down, silencing myself so that I wouldn't be too threatening or intimidating or smart. I wanted to make sure I was doing everything that I could because these men had it so hard and I didn't want to be the thing that was making it more difficult for them.
Yeah. That's so much pressure, and it's something that, again, I mean, it's it's undue pressure on both sides. But I think one of the things that you're kind of leading into is like the way you view yourself in these systems from
Mhm,
the female side. I mentioned the male side,
mhm.
but from the female side, I just interviewed Alice Gretchen.
Oh,
That
yeah.
episode should be coming out soon. Um, but or actually, it'll let me rephrase that. That episode came out already when this episode
Awesome.
is out, and so people can go listen to that. But I
Yeah.
know in her book,
Mhm,
she gets very detailed about that experience and talks
mhm,
about, modeling for the first time and seeing pictures of herself and
mhm,
all of the thought processes of, one, to even start doing that career
mhm,
felt like it's a violation of everything I was ever taught, and that I'm completely, you know, giving myself over to a horrible lifestyle.
mhm,
But then the part that really hit me is when she gets her first photos back and she had this moment of like being disassociated from the experience of going, who is this person? Like, this
mm,
person is
mhm,
beautiful. This person looks this
mhm.
way. That can't be me
Yeah,
because I'm not supposed to look like that.
yeah.
And I think that, again, there's so much self-worth that gets affected when you're saying, like you said, I have to dumb myself down. I have to
Mhm.
look a certain way. I've talked to women who literally got in trouble in college for having wet hair because people
Yeah,
might think, oh,
they were just in the shower.
yeah, oh,
Yeah,
I'm thinking about them in the shower now. And
yeah.
it's like, it's these bizarre things that
Mhm.
shouldn't even be part of your day to
Yeah.
day thinking.
Mm-mm.
Um, how do you go about working on the self worth side of things when you've been
Mm.
objectified from the time you're a little kid, and
Yeah.
by family, by friends, by pastors? Like, how do you go about becoming like an actualized person that can go like, this is me, this is what
Mhm,
I like to wear, this is who I like to be, this is how I
mhm.
like to talk, and I'm smart. I'm going to let myself be smart. Like, how do you go about embracing that and reclaiming that?
Yeah, so I consider purity culture a form of sexual abuse.
Hmm.
I know some people think that that's a really extreme way. I'm very careful to differentiate. I'm not calling it sexual assault. Sexual assault is a specific act that happens against somebody. It's an act of sexualized violence. But when we look at abuse and what that is, I believe purity culture falls under that. It is misusing our sexuality for an unintended purpose. And so I say that because I think that can help us frame like those questions, like how do you heal? Like how do
Mm.
you get some of this back? Because what the research actually does show is that the impacts of purity culture are hand in hand with how somebody is impacted by sexual assault. And that is researched.
Hmm.
Like that when people have experienced like the teachings and practices of purity culture and maybe they leave it, their physiological embodied responses and the way they interact with themselves, the world, and other relationships is almost identical to how sexual assault survivors navigate the world as well. And there's research to back that up.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The amount of shame, the amount of, I mean, at the very least, there's a lot of grooming within that,
Right.
within that
Yeah.
world. And
And yeah.
I was going to say, someone recently was on the show and she was talking about, she was saying, like, I feel like everybody in our denomination was groomed
Oh
with the way
yeah.
that sexuality was taught.
Yeah.
And some people were pretty upset about that statement, but I think that's
Mhm.
100% right. Like,
I do
when
too.
you're hearing preaching about, hey, your infant daughter should not wear sleepers because it looks like pants, like,
Yeah.
one, the immediate question I have as a parent now is like, who the heck is in the room that's like
Yeah.
stumbling over this thought? Because we should deal with them. And
Mhm.
the other piece of that is like, from an early age, you're being taught like, you are a piece of meat to be bought and sold. You're owned by
You're an
your dad. You're
object.
to be
Yeah.
sold off to your
Yeah.
husband. Like,
Yeah.
if that's not grooming, I don't know
Mhm.
what is.
I would completely agree with you. And so I think it's very important then that we actually look at purity culture using those words and those terms and the physiological symptoms that arise from that, because not only does that accurately describe the experiences, it also leads us towards the healing pieces of it.
Yep.
What are the interventions that we can use? Like I don't need to go create a new sexual trauma therapy for purity culture survivors. I can already
Mhm.
use what's out there.
Sure.
Um, and it shows the validity of like, yep, what happened really was that bad. And I think it just gives us a wealth of resources out there to be able to work with this. And I think then kind of going back to the beginning of the purity culture piece is like, because it's all encompassing, of course it encompasses the self-worth piece. I think, as we get back into our bodies in healthy ways, as we learn that, like, not only do we have a body, but our bodies are good. And, like our sexuality is
Hmm.
good. Like, that's how we can then start to branch out and really figure out, like, who am I apart from these things that happened to me, or these beliefs and practices that I had, or potentially the trauma that resulted from all of this.
Right. And even more so when someone is sexually abused physically
Yes.
in coordination with that teaching, which is,
Yeah.
I'm encountering a lot where, they were already taught to be ashamed. They're already taught all these things. They're already taught if you lose your virginity,
Mhm.
which that whole terminology, it's such a harmful thing. And then so you have people who are raped or sexually
Yeah.
assaulted who are going, okay, well, now I'm not even pure. Like,
Yeah.
there's layers of that,
Yep.
and that ties into now more fear of hell. Like, there's so many layers to this stuff that I think is so horrific. And beyond that,
Yeah.
just like, again, the fact that you can't wear a pair of pants without feeling slutty,
Yeah.
like, because that's the way you were taught. It's a mess to unwind all of that stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
What are some resources that you found? You mentioned like you don't need to go create a whole new resource. There's resources out there. What are
Mhm.
some resources that people should check out for this conversation?
Yeah, the one that I think is probably the most accessible is a book by Peter Levine called, oh gosh, I think it's called Sexual Healing. um,
Okay.
and it is for people who have endured sexual assault, sexual abuse, things like that. It is only available on audiobook, which I actually prefer because he has a
Sure.
very soothing voice and he leads you through exercises. The reason I always choose that book as a resource is because it is full of information. So he does help you understand what is happening in your body and why it is that you're having these responses, like what
Hmm.
sexual trauma does to you, like the psychological pieces. But then he also gently leads through exercises that help to get you back into your body, that help to help you to be able to create your body as a safe place to
No.
be. And so it's really, laying the foundation. Now, obviously, if everybody could work with a body-based trauma resolution, practitioner, that would be ideal. But I
Mhm.
do know that sometimes that's not feasible for a variety of reasons. So that is the direction that I tend to point people in. when there just aren't the resources, or we're just tiptoeing into this and we don't know if we want to like give our time and money to that. I also think Hillary McBride's book, Wisdom of the Body, can be really helpful in this case
You
too.
beat me to the punch on that
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so
Yeah.
gentle, as is, Hillary. I mean, it's like you can hear Hillary's voice through the words as you're reading them.
She's
Um,
someone I recommend audiobook
yeah.
if possible.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. So Peter Levine is like the male version where he just really has that very inviting, warm, comforting voice.
Hmm.
And there's like a sincerity and kindness behind it, which I think is true of Hillary as well. And so I would say like those two books are really great because it gives you the informational side of it, like the education side, but then it also leads you through some very gentle practices to start getting you back in your body, which really is the foundation for any sort of trauma
Hmm.
resolution. Yeah, that's where I'd
Yeah.
start.
Great. So when I write a book, I'll have Peter Levine do the audiobook so people don't have
Yes.
to hear this for 9 hours straight,